So you want to make a muse dash sharp. You have all the files set up now, but now you're wondering, how do I make my 15 star? I don't even know what a note direction is. But don't worry, I have the method for you. Today the goal is for you to learn the fundamentals and how to make a basic clean chart. Scene selection is by far either the easiest thing or the hardest thing depending on your song. But at the same time, it's one of the most important. It decides your note types, your boss, your everything. There are two main types of scenes. That is the normal scenes and the collab scenes. There's 7 normal scenes and 4 collab scenes. There's only one rule for choosing between a collab scene or a normal scene. That rule is to only use the collab chart if it's from that collab. For example, if it's from Groove Coaster, you can use the Groove Coaster scene. If it's from DJ Max, you can use the DJ Max scene, and so on. If it's not from a collab, you should only use the normal scenes, even if it's for a scene switch. But how do I select a scene? Vibes. By far my least favorite word in charting, but it's just true this time. If it sounds bright and happy, use Candyland. If it sounds more dark and gloomy, you put Castle. If it sounds pretty jazzy, use Rainy Night. If it's similar to City Pop, Retro City. If it uses traditional Asian instruments, Oriental. China. And to be honest, literally anything else, just use Space Station. Space Station just fits like basically everything. It's the same idea for a scene switch. If the change in vibe is big enough, you can scene switch. If you have no idea what scene it should be, you can always ask for help. There's a lot of songs that just fit into multiple scenes or none at all, and that's just a flaw of the game. If you need help, remember my Discord or the MDMC Discord is always in the description. Remember those 11 scenes we just went over? Each of them have their own unique boss, but the animations are the same between every single one. The most important thing you can remember about the bosses is that they all have 3 phases. Each phase can only do certain actions. Phase 0 can have a boss attack, boss masher, and boss exit. Phase 1 has boss projectile 1 and air gears, and phase 2 has boss projectile 2, boss projectile 3, and air gears. If you want to do an action in another phase, you must give the boss animation time. If you try to use an action in a different phase without enough animation time, the boss will glitch. Here's an example from the 9-star chaotic battle. You'll see the boss just sit there for a few frames before entering. This is usually what a boss glitch looks like. Here's the other one later in the same boss section. During the boss masher, the boss will teleport back to the right side of the screen and then back to the masher. This happens because there wasn't enough time to switch to phase 2. You'll also see the little guy just suddenly appear instead of popping out. That's all you need to know for bosses right now. Still happen to remember the 11 scenes we went over? As it turns out, just like the bosses, we have 17 note types per stage, 12 common notes and 5 hittables, dodgeables, whatever they are. Luckily, they're used almost the exact same way in each stage. For now, this is going to be a brief overview of how these note types are used, and we'll talk about actually when to use them later on. Okay, rapid fire. Smalls are usually used for low energy parts or fast rhythms. Mediums are used for almost any kind of energy level and should take up about 60 to 70% of the chart. Larges are usually used for accents and transitions. Hammers and raiders are used for even bigger accents and transitions. Holds are holds. Boss projectiles are the same thing as mediums but for boss sections. Geminis take up 2 lanes and are your all-purpose tool. They're accents, they transition, they structure, they do everything. Blue notes are most commonly used in low energy parts, mainly because they require minimal input. Parts are like blue notes, but they give back health. You need 2 per stage usually. One at 1/3 mark and one at the 2/3 mark. Mashers you mash, and they're usually used for transitions. Ghosts are usually used to chart beats that feel like they're missing or deviate from the pattern. Gears are usually used to fill space or for dodging accents. There's also 2 types of gears. There's the normal gears and boss gears. Normal gears usually stay on the ground only. That is just 3 small things we need to finish talking about. Variations, note directions, and dynamic notes. We're going to split the variations into 2 groups, ones you should use and ones you shouldn't use. You'll use both medium 1s and 2s. You should be switching through them very commonly through the chart. Same idea for large 1s and 2s, and same idea for boss projectile 2 and boss projectile 3. Do not use upside down hammers, do not use upside down raiders, and do not use normal gears on the high lane. Boss gears can go into the high lane, but normal gears should avoid the high lane. For note directions, you've probably seen it while playing, but you haven't thought about it very much. These are the notes that you'll commonly worry about the note direction for. For notes that do have direction, there's usually 3 types of note direction patterns that you'll use. There's the none type pattern, which has no note direction on any of the notes. The next type is the ease note direction. If the notes are in the high lane, they'll enter from the top of the screen. If the notes are in the low lane, they'll enter from the bottom of the screen. These are usually used for medium energy parts. The last common pattern is cross note direction. This is where the notes in the high lane, the notes will come from the bottom part of the screen, and the notes in the low lane will come from the top part of the screen. For hammers and raiders, they have a fixed direction. Hammers will always come from the top of the screen, and raiders will always come from the bottom of the screen. Mashers only have 2 types of directions. They have none direction, and one where they fly in from the top of the screen. It's important to know this for static and dynamic notes. Static notes are just notes that have no direction. Dynamic notes are literally anything else. Notes that appear, notes that have direction, or any kind of weird properties to them. Static notes often make a part feel more full, and they're easier to read because the notes don't come in any weird ways. Dynamic notes come in weird ways, making them much harder to read, and they can make this part feel more empty. Like for example, this part in ultra higher. This is why boss sections oftentimes feel more intense. The notes come out closer to you, making them dynamic. This is the section where we're going to learn the most fundamental rules for making a clean chart. To do this, we need to be able to decipher the structure of a song. There's 8 general categories a section of a song can fall into. Intro, verse, chorus, drop, solo, bridge, break, and outro. Something special that can happen with song structures as well too is that you can add pre before verse, chorus, drop, or bridge. So for example, you could have a pre-verse or a pre-drop. Usually just a build-up section that leads into those. But how do we determine what part it is?
Vibes.
Or more specifically, we need to be able to vibe out the energy of a part. This is usually determined by how intense the song sounds. The layering, how many instruments are going on. It's just vibes and experience. So let's take a look at an example of each of these categories and what their energy usually is. Starting with the intro. The intro is usually a one-time section that happens at the very beginning. The intro is kind of weird and that can be almost any energy level. You could have a very mild intro, you could have a very intense intro, or you could have a very, very low energy intro. Next is the verse. The verse is one of the most common parts. This part is usually low or medium energy, and usually you use smalls or mediums during these sections. Next is the chorus. The chorus is usually the most high energy part. It'll often repeat a few times throughout the song, and this is usually your boss section, or at the very least it uses mediums. Next is the drop. This part is very similar to the chorus. It's also a very high energy part that's usually a boss section or uses mediums. You can mainly categorize into parts that mainly use instrumentals, for example heavy EDM sections like these examples. Next is the solo section. This is basically the same thing as the drop, but it's usually a freestyle instrumental section. This also can be a boss section, but is usually a medium section. Next is the bridge. These sections are really weird, mainly because they just connect 2 parts. They're usually transition sections, or freestyle sections to break up a part. Next is the break. As the name implies, it's a break section. It's usually the lowest energy part of the chart. These are most commonly either just full on empty sections, or just blue note sections. Last is the outro. The outro is basically the same thing as the intro, but for the ending. The energy levels for these can vary, and it's just about vibing out the energy for it. So let's study a chart and look at its structure. The chart we'll look at is To do this, we're going to compare the energy of the song to the actual sections. Starting off with the intro. Basically no energy, so it's just empty plus a radar. And at the large, we switch into our first chorus part. The energy is relatively high even for an intro, so we're going to call this the chorus. We add an A next to the chorus because it repeats later. You'll notice that during this section, we're allowed to use a lot more note types. We mainly are using mediums, but we also have larges and holds. At the end of parts, there will oftentimes be transition sections that change the energy. In this case, it goes up because it switches to the drums. And then another small transition into our verse. This is the verse because the energy is so low. Because the energy is so low, we're using mainly smalls and the occasional gear. Those smalls also have no direction on them. Then we go to verse 2 because the vocals change and the energy goes up. The pattern's a little bit more complex, adding direction to the smalls, using holds, and Gemini's are dividing each of the repeats. Our next section is the bridge. Again, the bridge is always just connecting 2 parts. And this part is connecting the verse 2 into the chorus. Energy has gone up, so we're using mediums and mediums with direction. This brings us into our pre-chorus, which is a transition into our chorus. The energy of the song has gotten to the highest, mainly because all of the previous sections have been building up to this. And so instead of using just mediums, we're going to be using a boss section for this. Skipping ahead, we have a small transition that leads us into our solo part. We can tell it's a solo because there's a 1 instrument focus, in this case the guitar, and this part is mainly kind of a freestyle part. You can see that the energy of the song almost retains itself after the chorus part. This is usually true with solos happening after chorus parts and kind of retaining the energy. In this case, since we just came off a boss section, we're going to switch to using mediums. This leads us into our second bridge, which is connecting the solo back into our chorus. You can see this is labeled 2B because it's the exact same as our second chorus, but it's the second time it repeats. Skipping ahead again, we get our transition. And this will lead us back into our first chorus that happens at the beginning. As you can hear, it's almost exactly the same. Once again, you can see it's marked B because this is the second time it happens. And that leads us into our finale, which is different than almost every other part, but it's just our outro, mainly because it concludes the song. But why is any of that important? Because this helps us figure out two important things. Like I pointed out earlier in the example, the note types and note direction are often decided by the energy of the song. Chorus parts of songs are very commonly the boss section. On non-vocal charts, this can be a little harder to decipher, but with enough experience, they're very easy to tell. What can be a little bit more confusing is that solo sections and drop sections can also be boss sections. Again, this is all vibes and energy based. In our previous example, our song solo was the same energy as the boss section. That's why it's possible for drops and solos to be boss sections, because they usually carry the same energy as the chorus. Now, why is even this important? Repeats. Now we can take our same chorus from earlier and we can split it like this instead. Let's take a look how the same chorus looks now. During this first part, you'll see the same pattern repeat even when it flips. After a few repeats, we take the same pattern and switch medium types. When a new repeating melody appears, we repeat that instead. And then if there's a transition, we use a transition part. Any chart can be broken down like this as long as the part repeats a bunch. You'll see them use almost the same exact pattern. Create a pattern, repeat and flip, repeat and flip, repeat and flip. If it doesn't repeat at all, you can start a new section. In short, be able to identify your sections and find their repeats. So I've retained about 20% of this theory, but how do I actually use any of this? Well, you're going to use this info to build on two important fundamentals you need to be a good charter. This is structure and cleanliness. To help us understand these fundamental rules, we're going to try and make a chart, or at least I'm going to show my process of making a chart. This is a follow-up of the previous guide, which is the setup guide. I'm going to be using the same chart I set up there. I'll also link the same template file I'll be using in the description if you want to follow along that way too. One good habit I recommend to start with as well is to chart around your difficulty level. If you can't play past 9s, don't try and chart 10s and 11s. I also recommend sticking to lower difficulties just to learn the fundamentals at first. I'm going to be aiming for a 7-star in this, but again, you can go for whatever difficulty you want to. The first things you should always make sure you have set up are the scene, BPM, and note speed. The scene for the song I'm using is going to be Candyland, BPM 135, and for this song, I've chosen to use speed 3. Speeds are usually determined by BPM. Speed 1 is usually 100 and below, speed 2 is usually 100 to 140, and speed 3 is usually 140 and above. There are often times that you can use speed 3 for anything in the speed 2 range, mainly if there's a lot of 16ths, or it simply feels better. The first rule we can follow is to follow only one track. To do this, you should chart out the noise that you think is the most important, or just chart out all the noises in it and choose which one you feel like is the most important. Then afterwards, if you feel like the part needs more, or you feel like you can add around your one track, that's when you can add or accent. So listening to this part, the first thing I want to try and chart out is this piano and the drums at the intro. Winding up the noise of the hit sounds, this is what I get for the intro drums. Again, most of our notes will only land on 16 grid or 24 grid. It's very rare to go outside of that. After some trial and error, this is what I get for the piano part. What you'll notice is that the second part up here, these parts are basically identical. If you listen to the song, they sound almost exactly the same. The only thing that's different is there's one extra note on the end on the top. These are going to be our first two repeats. Continuing on, I keep charting and I find that the next two parts repeat exactly the same. And listening ahead, I see that it repeats exactly the same stuff again. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the parts that I have currently and I'm just going to copy and paste them. The last thing I notice here is that the drums pick up and we have a transition, which basically sounds like this. Listening to this, even though this is the intro, it sounds like we're starting off with a chorus part. I can also tell that because this same part will repeat throughout the chart. Again, our focus during this part is the piano. If we really wanted to, we could also try these extra sounds to see if they could fit anywhere. But remember, less is more. It's always good to focus purely on the piano if possible. The next rule you can follow is ignoring or simplifying for cleanliness. So we're going to focus on just doing this intro and chorus part real quick. To get a nice and clean pattern, even though it doesn't follow the notes exactly, we can still get the same feeling by using a gear hop at the beginning. Now let's focus on this chorus part. All we really need to do is make this first pattern and then we can just copy and paste it. But this can lead us into our next rule. Whenever we're changing sections, it's good to have a big accent or a big visual cue to show that you're changing sections. You can see on the left here, we have this large 2, which is to a crash noise. This is a very common noise you can add a transition to. In this case, we're going to use a large 2. It could be something like a large Gemini or Raider. Because this is a chorus, I'm planning to use mediums. Usually you don't want to open with a boss section, mainly because your boss sections should be saved for the highest energy part, which is usually in the middle and the end. Also because the energy is so high, I'm going to use the ease note direction, meaning the notes in the low lane are going to come up and into their lane from the bottom of the screen, and the high notes are going to come down and into the screen into the high lane. And so as I'm trying to follow the music and change the lanes based on how the music sounds, you should always try to make things symmetrical or feel like they're in groups. For example, during this part, I'm going to put everything into these kind of groups of 2. And again, because the next part is just a repeat, all I'm going to do is just copy and paste and flip the same pattern and adjust anything that isn't the perfect repeat. Now that we've done the pattern and then flipped it, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to change the mediums this time. We're going to change the medium too. So then after repeating that same part, what we get is we get another crash noise. and it actually repeats almost 1-to-1 until the transition section. So I'm straight up just gonna copy and paste and then fix this transition section into something else. Because this is just a build up into another section, and because the difficulty is very low, the best thing we can use for this many 16ths is just to use a masher. But before we leave this section, we're going to add one more thing. Because this is such a high energy part and there's a lot of empty space between the notes, we're going to add a few gears just to fill in those gaps. So the part that we have after this is going to be our verse. You can hear that the energy is much lower. So in this part, we're going to focus on the vocals only. And if there's any large gaps, we may add something in between. So I finished going through the vocals on this part, and my plan is to leave it just as smalls with no direction, just to show the big difference in energy. But what I'm left with during this part as well too is these very big gaps. And so what I'm going to do is, just like I said earlier, if I have a chance to add something in these gaps, I'm going to add it. I'm using ghosts in this case because, again, ghosts usually mark extra notes. Then at the end of this, we kind of have a little bit of a transition, but you'll notice that there's vocals plus there's some accents. So my goal during this is I'm going to still have the vocals, but I'm going to use larges for accents, and then I'm going to underchart these drums at the end using a hold. This is something common that you can do with drums or very fast rhythms, is use a hold to underchart it. So this is the pattern that I came up with. And so the next part here is our second verse. You can hear that it's much more high energy, but vocals are almost exactly the same. What I want to highlight during this part is the higher energy. So I'm going to take the same smalls, I'm going to add direction, I'm going to add some extra note types, and I'm going to use Geminis to divide each of the repeats. And so each time the pattern repeats, I'm just going to flip it. And so here's what I came up with. I also added gears in just again for the energy. During this part as well, I also found that a big gap here. Again, I'm just going to use one of the other noises to try and fill in this gap. Again, at the end of this section, I found that there was another transition part to the same kind of sound as the last transition, meaning I'll probably just use a masher here as well too. The rest of the sections will follow basically the same idea. All I'm really doing is I'm following the energy. The next section is going to be a bridge. Again, our whole goal is to build up towards the highest energy part, which is usually our chorus or our boss section. So after we're done with smalls, we're going to move to mediums. So let's skip ahead to the boss section. Again, this is supposed to be the highest energy part of the song, but if you listen to the vocals, they don't have much energy in terms of difficulty behind it. So this is a good spot where, since our energy is very high, we should add an extra part. Another rule to follow is try to stick to max 3 note types per section. Something else you can do is when you have very long holds, for example this part here, you can again add stuff over those holds. For example here, I'm going to end the hold at the large one and start the vocals again. You can also listen for little extra instruments to help with adding little transitions to break up the part. And always remember, when you're charting something out, look for repeats and look for little small patterns that you can throw in to break up the part as well too. For example here, I find this little pattern that I turn into this. At the end of my boss section, I again hear a drum build up. I decided to use a boss masher. What I need to make sure of is that none of my boss projectiles are going to affect its animation. If you need to give the boss time, you can always replace boss projectiles with mediums. You should try to leave 2 measures worth, which are these numbers on the left. Also remember at the end of the boss section to add a boss exit. The only time this is not true is if you use masher 2. After the boss section, we get a repeat of the first chorus. All I'm going to do is copy and paste the first chorus 1-to-1, no changes. After this chorus part, what we're left with is a break part. If you remember, this is our lowest energy part, so we're going to focus on making it feel like the lowest energy. So even though we could follow the vocals here, I actually choose to follow the piano part in the background. And so then from this point, I'm just going to follow the exact same pattern I've been following. I'm going to build up towards our highest energy parts with the same kind of note type pattern, and I'm going to copy and paste when I need to copy and paste. The only last thing that we can talk about here, which is a little bit more advanced, is taking a repeat, and if the song sounds more intense, we can add more to it. For example, in this last boss section, the song actually has even higher energy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this part to a phase 2. This is also something you can do on the second repeat of the same boss section, is just use phase 2, just for the sake of making sure it's not boring. Remember at the end also to add a hearts at 1/3 and 2/3 of the way through the song. You said you can actually import your MDM after you finish your chart. In your charts folder, you're going to select cover, demo, info, map 2, and music. Right click on one of the files, go to 7-zip, add to archive. This window should appear. All you need to do in this window is change the .zip to .mdm. And make sure archive format is zip. Now move the .mdm into the custom albums folder. If you open up Muse Dash and search the title of your song from your info file, you should find it in game. If you need to update your chart at all, find it in custom albums, go to 7-zip, open archive, and then we'll go back to our song folder. We'll drag the map 2 into the zip and hit yes. So I aimed for a 7-star and my chart turned out to be an 8-star. That's also a part of charting. Just some things don't go as you expect them perfectly. But without further ado, here's Mint Blue Girl by Endorphin.
Ready, go! 掃除は私の仕事なので。
Since this last section was a big info dump, let's do a small recap. Learn how to vibe out energy, chart around your skill level, and usually when you first start, it's better to chart lower difficulties, like 7, 8, 9s, maybe a 10. Focus on one track at a time and accent when you can. If your main track has a gap, it's okay to fill or focus on something else while you wait for it to come back. Similar to focusing one track, learn to ignore noise and simplify patterns. Always have good structure using accents. And the most important thing you can do, repeat a lot. And remember that there are many people willing to help you with charting. As always, my Discord's below. There's a whole Discord server full of people who are willing to help too and chart just like you. And what's the secret to learning how to chart well? Chart a lot. And I guess you can study official. They're pretty good at it most times.